Good afternoon, everybody. We have the fun of telling you about Pueraria mirifica, which really stands for miracle herb. And what we want to get across is that we've been very fortunate to learn in northern Bangkok by the World Health Organization's own statistic that they have the lowest incidence of breast cancer in the world. So we are all concerned about hormonal imbalances, and Bill Anton gave us a great introduction to the complexities of dealing with proper handling of hormonal deficiencies. Now, there is a lot of confusion, and I'm glad it's been brought up several times today that, after all, heart disease is still the number one. And way down there we have things like ovarian cancer, and breast cancer is nowhere near as big a contributor to death, yet 46,000 women do die of breast cancer, and every year 400,000 die of heart disease. But it puts a little pressure on those of us that would like to be doing hormonal replacement, because there's a little suggestion in the literature that some forms of estrogen aren't so terribly safe. In the same time, I really feel it's important that we have hormonal replacement that's safe, because I'm very concerned about Alzheimer's and I'm very concerned about osteoporosis. So I think we may have found something here. Approximately 45 million women in the United States are in menopause. 15 million will not have significant symptoms. 30 million are going to wind up with symptoms. And out of that, a large number are going to try the pharmaceutical approach. But there's a large group that are going to be interested in alternatives. Some years ago, they blew the lid off of the Premarin and the HRT, and things started looking a little bit less favorable. Time magazine suggested that HRT was increasing breast cancer 26%, heart disease 23%. So this is when things started to change, and Premarin didn't look like the answer we'd all been told it was. And you'll notice that between cancer, heart disease, and blood clots, you've got some significant numbers there to think about. Now, Bill Anton just covered the importance of genetic testing, which is going to change everything in many ways. But a Joel Evans at Albert Einstein is suggesting in his lectures that if you plan to do HRT, you need to look at some of these particular single nucleotide polymorphisms, because these people may be at greater risk when you want to treat them with the hormones. And I think we have to look at benefit to risk ratio in everything we do. But with 5% of people walking around with things like Leiden disease, it's important to think about blood clotting being one piece of this puzzle of dealing with both heart disease and the hormone replacement. Now, this report said that using HRT short-term seemed to give a little benefit, but they sure don't want to be on it very long. Then another report comes out and says, well, yeah, but it's not going to have so many increases in heart attacks, but it will definitely contribute to more thromboembolism. So I have become very interested in the whole story of blood clotting. And you can use a lab like thrombocare.com in the United States, and you can spend from $3,000 to $6,000 really looking at 40 different diseases that go way beyond the issue of just Leiden-5 and get into many complex situations that lead to what we now believe that clots are deeply involved in the death of most people that are called a heart attack was really a clot. And so venous thromboembolism is an area that we need to be aware of. And when we get into the risk for cardiovascular disease, obviously you're going to move then into an area of selective estrogen receptor modulators. And I'm bringing that up because when we start talking about estrogen, we're going to have to bring up the whole topic of estrogen receptors. And that's going to change a lot of what we think we understand. So things are in a state of flux in terms of the world, and I do believe that Pueraria mirifica may turn out to be really an ideal natural agent to work with the estrogen receptor. And we are going to have Margaret Ritchie of St. Andrews Medical School doing some very exciting studies for us to further prove what we think and believe from the studies we've done is going on, so that when we're dealing with Pueraria mirifica, we look like we can have a double win, and I'll explain what I mean. I'm still, as I said, very worried about osteoporosis. Although estrogen is not indicated for primary prevention of osteoporosis, it should be considered for any postmenopausal woman that's at risk of osteoporosis. Well, they say that's 1 out of 2. As long as she is symptomatic, well, a lot of people have back pain, and is not at high risk of breast cancer, well, that's 1 out of 2, of high risk of breast cancer, cardiovascular. So this is mumbo jumbo. This is a very current osteoporosis report, but it leaves you nowhere. It says as long as the patient you're seeing has no risk of heart disease and no significant risk of breast cancer, you might think about estrogen, but that's not where I want to take you. Yesterday I made some statements about the fact that the body burden is a term that I use on my website, gordonresearch.com, to take you into where my thinking is. My thinking has been shaped by the Environmental Working Group, and they have made it very clear that for a lousy $4,900 a person, obviously that's a lot of money, but the one at the National Geographic I mentioned was $13,000. But this gave you some real insight in, since nobody can pass the test, there's going to be problems. And anybody you test, the researchers at 2 major labs found about 167 chemicals, pollutants, or pesticides in the blood and urine of the adults they studied in this particular study, and it has been repeated since then by the NIH under the Haynes study, and we've done it on 5,000 people, and no one is free of these toxins. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about 62 average in this audience. If we tested all of you the same way, you'd have some toxins for your nervous system, your brain, and some toxins for our hormone system. So we got to plug this into our thinking when we're trying to figure out how we're going to back our ways out of this problem. Because if 6- and 8-year-old children are now in puberty and developing large breasts, we've got some things we have to try to put together so we can see that there's a lot of toxic chemicals for our immune system, reproductive, and carcinogens in our diet. So this article, winding up that series of 4 slides, says that even low doses may be far more harmful than previously believed. And in the National Geographic, I mentioned to you that we actually had the professor, David Ewan Duncan, found it was loaded with the flame retardants because he spends a lot of time on airplanes. And then they interviewed him about this, and he said his internist, because he didn't treat himself, he went to an internist, and his internist said, I don't really know what to do all this. He said, essentially, they came up with a joke. They said, well, come back and see me if you start to glow in the dark. That was actually a live interview on nationwide television. So the thing is, this is just something some of you may not have picked up. Diabetes Care suggesting that these little things are rather important to us, because here they're saying that it ties into obesity, and the next slide says that there's a 38-fold increase in the risk of diabetes if you're in the higher percentile of these tests. So I'm trying to tie together a lot of information here that we have to plug into our consciousness, that being careful is not going to do it for you. There's no place to escape. We are breathing air. That air is generated, and as we burn coal in China, we're going to load up all of the air of the planet with lead, mercury, and cadmium, and we get even in America, helps poison Europe, and it just keeps going around. And so what I want to make sure that we all understand, that we've got all these chemicals in our body, and I took lead as the easiest way to alert everybody to one way of putting your arms around the problem. And I did point out that since it's published in JAMA a year and a half ago by Harvard, that if you simply buy that little X-ray fluorescence, instead of focusing on just density of bone, you can focus on how much lead is in bone. And do you care? Yes. Because they showed the bones are not just safely storing the lead so it's going to be there when you die. The bones are in equilibrium with all the tissues in your body, your kidneys, your heart, your liver, and your brain, all the way to the eye. And they showed the higher the level of lead in your bones, the sooner you will have mature cataracts needing surgery. So now we can see that even the phthalates from our plastic bottles have been directly tied into being an estrogen mimic, provoking insulin resistance and diabetes. So we've got a lot of things when we start talking hormones we got to be figuring about. So estrogen mimics is a very big subject, and I'm sorry this is not going to be legible, so we'll go on with that one.